So many of you are probably familiar with Euclid's most famous result on prime numbers. This result is often stated as saying that there are infinitely many prime numbers. And there are some commonly believed facts about this proof, many of which you may have been taught by teachers or professors. Some of these facts include, number one, Euclid proved that there are infinitely many primes. Number two, Euclid's proof is a proof by contradiction. Number three, Euclid multiplied the first n primes together. And number four, Euclid's proof is not constructive. Many of these claims have been repeated over and over again, year after year, decade after decade. There's only one problem, though. None of them are true. Let's start with myth number one. Euclid proved that there are infinitely many prime numbers. Before we address this myth, let's first be clear about what questions we're not trying to answer. We are not trying to determine if there are infinitely many primes. Of course, there are infinitely many primes. No one disputes this fact. More specifically, we are not trying to determine if a particular proof that there are infinitely many primes is correct or not. We will discuss both the conceptual and pedagogical merits of various proofs, but all of the proofs we'll discuss are technically correct. Finally, we are not trying to determine if the infinitude of the primes follows from Euclid's proof. It turns out that this is true, and I have a lot to say about this particular point, but for the moment, that is not the question we're asking. No, we are asking a very particular question, a question that can only be answered by using a combination of historical and mathematical evidence. In Proposition 20 of Book 9 of the Elements, did Euclid actually state and prove that there exist infinitely many primes? To answer this question, we need to keep in mind that the Elements was written over 23 centuries ago, and it was a compilation of previous results from up to 25 centuries ago. It was originally written in Greek, and only later translated into Latin and English. This is a copy of the most commonly used English translation of the Elements by Sir Thomas Heath, a British scholar and historian of ancient Greek mathematics. Let's take a look at Heath's English translation of the Greek text. Heath translates Euclid's result as, prime numbers are more than any assigned multitude of prime numbers. We need to translate this statement as faithfully as possible into modern mathematical language. This translation process is aided by carefully working through Euclid's proof, which we'll do in just a moment. But for now, here is a faithful modern translation. Let P1 up to PR be any finite set of primes. Then there exists a prime Q such that Q is not equal to Pi for any I. In other words, given any finite set of primes, we can always find another prime that is distinct from all those primes. It is very important to note here that Euclid makes no claim about the set of all primes being an infinite set, or having infinitely many members. Euclid does not claim that there exist infinitely many primes. In fact, Euclid does not even mention the set of all primes. And the fact is that the ancient Greek mathematicians of Euclid's time simply did not have the same Cantorian conception of infinite sets that we have today. Nevertheless, having translated the statement of Euclid's result into modern terminology, we can then ask the question whether this result can be used to prove that the set of all primes is infinite. There are two approaches we can take. The first is to use a proof by contradiction. This is the usual proof presented in textbooks and lectures, although there are different variations of this approach, some with serious pedagogical drawbacks. We first suppose the set of all primes is finite. We then use Euclid's result to derive a contradiction. And from this contradiction, we deduce that our original assumption is false, and so the set of all primes must be infinite. The second approach is a constructive proof. We begin with any finite set of primes. Then we establish a well-defined rule for choosing a prime divisor of a given composite number. For example, we could always choose the smallest such prime divisor. This step is important because without it, we'd have to rely on something like the axiom of countable choice, and we'd prefer not to do that. Finally, we use recursion to explicitly construct an infinite sequence of distinct primes. Note that in either case, whether we use an indirect proof by contradiction or a constructive proof, there is more work to do beyond Euclid's result to show that there exist infinitely many primes. Now let's look at the second myth, that Euclid's proof is a proof by contradiction. To examine this myth more closely, we need to carefully study Euclid's proof. Again, let's return to Heath's English translation. Here is the proof reformulated into modern mathematical language. Let's examine it line by line. Euclid begins by forming the integer n, which is one more than the product of all the primes in our finite set. The main idea of the proof is to use this new integer n to find another prime not in our original set. However, note that Euclid does not make any claim that this given finite set of primes consists of all prime numbers. Next, Euclid asserts that n is either prime or composite. In other words, he splits the proof into two cases. From a modern viewpoint, this isn't really necessary, because the two cases can be treated as one. But we're trying to stick as faithfully as possible to Euclid's reasoning. What is really important to note about this particular aspect of the proof is that it already refutes the notion that Euclid's proof is by contradiction. After all, if Euclid had supposed that his set consisted of all primes, as so many authors and teachers have told us, then why would he even bother to consider the case of n being prime? Such a case would have already been ruled out for the sake of contradiction. Euclid correctly notes that if n is prime, then we are done, because n itself can serve as our new prime. Now Euclid considers the case in which n is composite. He uses a result he previously proved, that every composite number is divisible by a prime. Many people misrepresent this step in the proof by claiming that Euclid relied upon unique factorization, or the fundamental theorem of arithmetic. But unique factorization is not necessary. Only the existence of a prime factor. And in fact, the fundamental theorem of arithmetic was not known to Euclid, and would not even be stated for several more centuries. Now we come to a small piece of the proof that does employ proof by contradiction to prove a claim within the proof. Euclid notes that if this prime divisor of a composite n is equal to any of our original primes, then it must divide 1, which is a contradiction. So this prime divisor qualifies as a new prime, distinct from our original primes. Now, looking over the entire proof, we see that there are two pieces of evidence that decisively show that Euclid did not assume that he had collected all primes together into a finite set. The first piece of evidence has already been noted, namely that he considers the case of n being prime separately, which would be absurd if our original set consisted of all primes. But the second piece of evidence is even more fundamental, and that is that Euclid never uses the assumption that there are finitely many primes. Go ahead, pause the video, and read through the proof again from start to finish. At no point do we ever use or need to use such an assumption. Therefore, any presentation of Euclid's proof that begins by assuming that there are only finitely many primes is simply prepending an unnecessary assumption to artificially manufacture an alleged proof by contradiction. But we should also remember that while we don't need a proof by contradiction to establish Euclid's result, we do need something else to establish that there are infinitely many primes. And proof by contradiction is one way to do that. Here is such a proof by contradiction that directly uses Euclid's result. We first suppose that there are only finitely many primes, say P1 up to PR. And these are all the primes. By Euclid's theorem, there is another prime Q that is distinct from all of these. This is a contradiction. So we conclude there are infinitely many primes. While this proof is not ideal, it is at least transparent. And it reveals that the essential use of proof by contradiction is to deduce the infinitude of the set of all primes, and not to construct a new prime from a given finite set of primes. But this transparent proof is not always given. And because proof by contradiction opens up an entire world where everything is true and false at the same time, there are a variety of other proofs by contradiction. And many of these proofs are not transparent at all. Here is one notable example. This proof by contradiction does not use Euclid's result, but instead bobs and weaves through a thicket of bewildering statements. Suppose there are only finitely many primes, say P1 up to PR. Let n be one more than the product of all these primes. Now, if n is composite, it must be divisible by some prime pi. But this implies that pi divides the difference between n and the product of all the primes. In other words, pi divides 1, which is a contradiction. So n cannot be composite. So n must be prime. But this contradicts that P1 up to PR were supposed to constitute all primes. We conclude there are infinitely many primes. This proof is both confusing and misleading. By not confining the use of proof by contradiction, it gives the mistaken impressions that some hypothetical set of all primes is necessary to construct a new prime, and that n is actually prime. The third myth about Euclid's proof is that Euclid multiplied the first n primes together. After translating Euclid's statement into modern language and working through his proof, it's easy to see that this is not what he intended. Euclid's argument works for any finite set of primes, not just the first n primes. A more interesting question is how this misconception originated and why it has persisted for so long. This is just my own speculation, but the best explanation I can think of is that this myth is based on the previous myth we just discussed. Any proof by contradiction will begin by assuming not just that we have any finite set of primes, but a finite set containing all primes. Based on this misconception, it's easy to superimpose some hypothetical finite set of all primes onto an actual initial segment of primes, leading to the erroneous conclusion that Euclid multiplied the first n primes together. This combination of inadvisable proof by contradiction and the mistaken impression that Euclid multiplied the first n primes together leads to pedagogical disaster. For example, a very common mistake students make is to conclude that all Euclid numbers are prime. A Euclid number is one more than the product of an initial segment of primes. For example, 30,031 is a Euclid number because it is one more than the product of the first 6 primes. Note that 30,031 is not prime because it has prime factors 59 and 509. Of course, this is perfectly consistent with Euclid's proof, but it can be very disconcerting to students who have been presented a confusing proof by contradiction, in which the hypothetical number that is one more than the product of all primes is itself asserted to be prime. This state of ontological disorientation even leads some students to believe they have found a flaw in Euclid's proof. Another common mistake is the conclusion that Euclid's proof always yields a prime exceeding all the given primes. Again, this misconception can only arise from the notion that Euclid multiplied the first n primes together. In fact, there are many sets of primes that only yield primes smaller than all the original primes. For example, 5 and 7 lead us to 36, whose only prime factors are 2 and 3. But perhaps the most damaging pedagogical effect is that students are robbed of the opportunity to explore the interesting mathematics that results from studying constructively defined sequences of primes. And this leads us to our final myth. And perhaps the most pernicious myth of all, that Euclid's proof is not actually constructive. Recall our constructive proof that there are infinitely many primes. Actually, this is not just one proof, but a family of proofs, each generating a different infinite sequence of distinct primes. For example, a very natural choice is to begin with the empty set of primes and always choose the smallest prime factor of n. Since the empty product is 1, our first value of n is 2, giving us our first prime. 1 more than 2 is 3, giving us our second prime. Then we multiply 2 and 3 together and add 1, giving us 7, also prime. So the first 3 terms in our sequence are 2, 3, and 7. It's tempting to conjecture at this point that we'll always get a prime. But we should be cautious, taking into account our previous observation about Euclid numbers. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video now and take the time to work out the first 9 terms of this sequence. And remember, each time you add 1 to the product of the previous terms, you need to check the prime factorization. So you probably want to use Wolfram Alpha or some other computer algebra system. Here is the sequence you should have obtained. This is actually a very famous sequence called the Euclid-Mullen sequence. And it is sequence A000945 at the Online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences. It is an open question whether every prime appears in this sequence. This is a genuinely interesting question because it feels intuitively true. However, it has been shown that the similar sequence obtained by taking the largest prime factor at each step omits infinitely many primes. In addition to minimizing confusion and mistaken conclusions, the constructive approach has many pedagogical benefits. As we have seen, by changing our initial finite set of primes, or our rule for choosing a prime divisor, or by forming the integer n in a different way, or any combination of these, we can construct many other fascinating sequences of distinct primes. Another benefit is that studying Euclid's constructive proof naturally leads into discussions of other types of constructive proofs of the infinitude of the primes. One famous example uses the Fermat numbers. Finally, the constructive approach emphasizes the fact that number theory is a concrete subject of numerical experimentation and exploration. I have to admit myself that I thought a lot of these myths were true for a long time, and when I first found out they weren't, I was pretty skeptical of it, and I had to really read about it and think about it. There's a couple of good papers on this written by Michael Hardy and Catherine Woodgold, and I'll link to a couple of their papers in the description below. I would encourage you to go and read them. And I think what this demonstrates more than anything is that mathematicians are not necessarily good historians, and that it's always a good idea to go back to the original text, the original works, and read what they actually have to say and see if that matches up with what you've been told to believe.